Following the end of British Leyland, sale of Rover Group, and finally the collapse of MG Rover, the marques that made up these volume car manufacturing giants have seen many owners, from boom to bust. This is the story of how the brands were passed to companies like SAIC, a Chinese state-owned car manufacturer, how BMW made sure Rover wouldn't meet the same fate as MG, and where Triumph, Austin, Riley and all of the other brands ended up. This is the history of the great British brands that defined an industry, and were once a common sight on our roads, but now through mismanagement, government interference and meddling, are now owned by car companies in countries such as China, India and Germany. This is Who Owns What. Hello everybody and welcome to this video. If you're not subscribed already, please make sure to do so. It really does help me out and you get to see more of this. More history videos, more cars and conversions uncovered, and more projects like my Rover SD1 2600R. This video is about the brands that defined the British motor industry and created British Leyland. In this video we chart them from their beginning to their very end, and where they are now and who owns them. Do you have any memories of these brands like Riley, Austin, Wolseley, MG and Rover? Let me know in the comments below. And what is your opinion on the current crop of brand ownership? Make sure to like the video if you liked it, but without further delay, let's get into this video on who owns what. To understand where the brands are now, we need to first look at the history of their ownership, starting in the early 20th century. Most, if not all of these brands were independent. Wolseley, Standard, Morris, Riley, MG, Austin, Vanden Plas, Rover, Alvis, Lanchester, Daimler, Jaguar and Triumph. These brands were largely independent through to the mid-1940s, but would begin to merge as brands fell during and after World War II. Wolseley, founded in 1901 by Vickers and Herbert Austin, would dominate the Edwardian era, but its success would be short-lived. After its peak as the largest motor manufacturer in Britain in 1921, 6 years later in 1927 it would enter receivership, thanks to overexpansion. William Morris would purchase Wolseley from Vickers Limited that year. Morris Garages, or MG, was founded in 1924 by Cecil Kimber and owned by William Morris. Riley, founded in 1896, would, as with most car manufacturers, find its roots in the great pedal cycle craze at the end of the 19th century. Percy Riley, one of the later founders of Riley Coventry Limited, would build his first car at 16 in 1898, in secret, because his father did not approve of the risky venture. Riley would continue to produce cars, becoming a success story in its own right, and a consistent one at that. But in 1938, following the failure of negotiations with Triumph to merge, the company would be placed into receivership. William Morris would purchase Riley that year. The Morris brand, founded by William Morris in 1912, under the company WR Motors, would become Morris Motors in 1919 and would remain independent of the brands acquired by William Morris during the 20s and 30s. All of these marques would be merged into the Nuffield organisation, the largest British car maker of its time, in 1943. Meanwhile, the Triumph Motor Company, formed in 1930, found itself after 6 years in 1936 in financial dire straits. The Dolomite wasn't selling in the numbers anticipated. Triumph would sell its successful bicycle and motorcycle business that year to raise capital to keep going. In 1939, the Triumph Motor Company would enter receivership. A scrappage company, Thos W. Ward, would purchase the factory, equipment and other assets, but the outbreak of war and the bombing of the Holbrook Lane works would destroy Triumph's ability to make cars. In November 1944, Triumph was simply a shell of its former self. The Standard Motor Company would swoop in and purchase the remains to reform Triumph, transferring the production of Triumphs to Canley. In Longbridge, another big name was making moves to beef up its lineup of cars. Austin, founded by Herbert Austin in 1905 in an abandoned printworks in Longbridge, was also making a series of acquisitions. The great decline in coach-built cars would lead to the British arm of Vanden Plas being purchased by Austin in 1946, allowing Austin and Vanden Plas to produce a series of luxury limousines, which had long been Austin's ambition. Another company wasn't doing much in the way of acquisitions, however. That company was an independent Rover. Founded in 1904 in Coventry and moving to Solihull in 1947 after its restructuring, the independent Rover company were making incredible cars and creating new brands, such as Land Rover in 1948, with its first car, the Series 1, designed by Maurice Wilks. Daimler, founded in 1896 and Lanchester, founded in 1899, would be purchased by the BSA Group, a major British industrial group covering all from firearms to bicycles to buses. BSA would purchase SS cars. BSA would then divest its car brands and be followed by Jaguar and Daimler. The stage was set for the first series of mergers. You had the following companies: Austin, consisting of Austin and Vanden Plas; Rover, which was just Rover and Land Rover; the Nuffield organisation, Riley, MG, Morris and Wolseley; Standard Triumph and the remnants of Dawson; Jaguar and Daimler, which was just Jaguar and Daimler. The brands that wouldn't make it past the 50s would be SS Cars and Lanchester. The final Lanchester would be the Sprite, its final original design. It was never put into production. The brand Lanchester is now owned by Jaguar Land Rover. SS Cars would continue as Jaguar after its rebrand. The brand SS Cars is still owned by Jaguar Land Rover today. The 1950s to 1960s were all about the second series of major mergers. Austin and Nuffield would merge to form BMC in 1952. Rover would purchase Alvis and then merge them into the Rover company. Leyland, manufacturer of trucks and buses, would enter the car building craze, purchasing Standard Triumph, with the Standard name now making way for its much stronger stablemate Triumph. The final Standard to be produced would be an Ensign Deluxe. This would roll off the production line in May 1963. The Standard name would officially be retired in 1968. In the mid-1960s, a frenzy would begin. The British motor industry would start putting all its eggs in one basket. BMC would merge with Jaguar and Daimler to form British Motor Holdings. Rover would buy Alvis in 1965. 2 years later, Rover and Alvis would be purchased by Leyland Motors in 1967. Sadly, Alvis, even though there were promises by Rover's executives in the media to keep car production going, Alvis would be discontinued around this time, with its last car being the TF21. Of the 14 companies that started it all, there were now only 2 left: Leyland Motors and British Motor Holdings, formerly BMC. These 2 companies in 1968 would make history, forming the largest British car company ever, British Leyland, the largest employer at its height, with around 128,000 people directly employed at 40 locations. This empire was vast, but it wasn't built to last. During the BLMC era, several brands would come and go. First would be Riley, with its last being the Riley Kestrel in 1969. Mini would be founded as a separate marque that same year. Austin Healey, a part of BMC, would be discontinued in 1971, with the Austin Healey Sprite Mark IV ending the joint venture between Donald Healey and Austin. Wolseley would be nailed to the nose of the Princess, ending its 74-year history as a simply badge-engineered Austin. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, BLMC would break up, thanks to the turmoil that plagued its short life. Jaguar would go its own way in 1984, taking Daimler with it. Austin Rover Group would be formed, and to shield Land Rover in these unknown times, a separate entity would be created, which would eventually be merged into Rover Group anyway, under British Aerospace. In the 1980s, the legacy brands, the brands that got Britain moving, would see the end of the road. First and arguably the saddest would be Triumph, a marque that started with illustrious sports cars, known for cars like the TR4 and TR3. In its final act, it would become a rebadged Honda, as the Triumph Acclaim in 1981, ending its 99-year history in 1984, thanks to a lack of investment. The Triumph name was gone for good. Morris and Austin, the two that defined their golden eras of the 1950s and 60s, their fates intertwined ever since, with cars like the Mini, the Morris Minor, and ADO 16 would finish their history very close together, with the Ital being the last Morris badged car, ending production in 1984, and Austin 4 years later, being removed from the Metro, Maestro and Montego in 1988. Vanden Plas in the 1980s would turn into a trim level, continuing on and off until the late 2000s. The 90s marked the British giants, once titans of industry, now mortally wounded, slipping into foreign hands. BMW would acquire Rover Group in 1994 from British Aerospace. Jaguar and Daimler would be sold to Ford. Rover Group would be broken up only 6 years later. BMW would retain Land Rover, Triumph, Mini and Rover, finally consigning its 1970s rival Triumph to history for good. The brand is still dormant today. MG, Riley, Morris, Austin, Wolseley would be sold to Phoenix Venture Holdings in 2000 for £10, but Rover would be licensed to MG Rover, under the condition they could never create an SUV bearing its name. This was mainly to keep the Land Rover brand from being tarnished. When MG Rover collapsed in 2005, NAC, now SAIC, a state-owned Chinese car manufacturer, would purchase MG, Austin, Wolseley, Morris, Riley and Vanden Plas, and would attempt to purchase Rover, so they could continue to produce the 75 badged as a Rover in China. They would find that MG Rover didn't actually own Rover, and BMW weren't prepared to sell. NAC would create Roe, which in its native tongue is Rover, to sell Rover 75s in China. BMW would sell the name to Ford in 2006, and Ford would merge Jaguar and Land Rover in a package deal to Tata Motors of India to form Jaguar Land Rover. This leads us to the present day. So who owns what? SAIC, the state-owned car manufacturer, own Riley, MG, Wolseley, Morris, Austin and Vanden Plas, with MG the only name appearing on cars currently produced. BMW own Triumph and Mini, with Triumph simply sitting dormant. Mini is the only name being produced. Tata Motors of India own Rover, Land Rover, Jaguar, Daimler and Lanchester, with Land Rover and Jaguar the only names being produced. BAE Systems own Alvis, but only its military vehicle arm. Alvis, however, is currently producing cars independently today, under the Continuation series. And that is where we are today. Of all the marques that made it, only one is owned by a British company. The British car industry is still alive thanks to the foreign investment, but the strategic mistakes by both government and management during the 20th century meant what we see today was the inevitable conclusion. It's not as Quentin Wilson said in 2005 that we can't make cars. We can. We just couldn't manage it at the time, with government interference making manufacturers build factories miles and miles away from their supply chains, resulting in disaster, and management, in the case of MG Rover, selling the crown jewels to the Chinese before the deal was even signed in 2005, meaning to NAC, MG Rover simply had no value, leaving them to pull out of the deal with what they actually wanted. I believe now, thanks to the new wave of management, brands like Jaguar Land Rover are absolutely thriving. Brilliant Land Rovers and its sister brand Range Rover are the spiritual successors of the Rover brand. And that is the end of the video. I hope you've enjoyed this summary of who owns what and how. A history of how the brands that formed British Leyland changed ownership from boom to bust to present day. Let me know in the comments below, could any of these brands come back? Do you have any memories of them? But as always, thank you for watching, keep watching and remember to subscribe for more of this, and I'll see you in the next one.